Thank you, Jenny. Jenny, how about that?
Amen.
Man, oh man. Well, good morning, Calvary. How are you doing?
Good morning.
It's good to see you guys. Thanks for having me come. It's always a joy to be with you. Hopefully to encourage you guys a little bit, share a little bit about what's happening with us and get into God's Word just a little bit. My good friend Aaron is here this morning. All of you know Aaron. What's up, Aaron? He's going to be capturing some footage for Calvary over the next several weeks, and so I agreed to be the guinea pig to launch this out while Jeff's away. So all the mistakes will happen today, and he'll get all the kinks out so that when Jeff comes up, he'll be all fine-tuned and ready to roll. So it is good to be with you. We're learning a lot, as you guys know, about how to retool, how to begin to truly exist as a missionary people here in our city. And just to keep it real with you guys, this retooling process is probably one of the hardest things I've ever done before. But what I can tell you is that I am genuinely encouraged because we're beginning to see gospel fruit.
Amen.
Be born, and that's what it's all about, right?
Amen.
And so this morning we're going to be talking a little bit about spiritual gardening. You can kind of see the setup. You see the front page of your bulletin. And so let me just start by asking you guys a question. How many gardeners do we have in the room? Show of hands. Oh yeah, we got some. Good. How many of you have been gardening for 5 years? Oh, everybody's still up. 10 years. Okay. 20 years. 30. 35. 35. Okay. We got a bunch of master gardeners in the room. I'll be coming to see you after the service. I am not a master gardener. So we're in our second year of having our garden. I tell you what, we value the garden. We believe in the garden. And if it was up for our garden to survive, I wouldn't be up here today. So we are slowly learning what it means to be good stewards of the soil, good stewards of the seed. Our goal is that eventually 50% of our garden will take care of our family. That's what we're trying to get to. So I don't know if we'll make it there. We're at 5% right now, more than likely. Somewhere in that ballpark. That may be overstating this a little bit. But kind of what we're learning is that there's some lessons hardwired into the fabric of creation, isn't there? From the garden. If you think about just that seed that starts, and that DNA is contained in that seed. That seed, however, must go into the ground. It must die, right? For life to begin to sprout. Think about the early years of tending to that little shoot and how you must take care of it and nurture it. Think about the tending process. Think about the cultivation, maybe the pruning. Think about the adversity that has to come that's going to kind of test that vegetable, that vine, that plant, to see if it's going to last or not. But what's the goal? The goal is that day of harvesting. Man, you pick that first piece of fruit off and you start to partake, and you're like, man, this is it. This is what it's all about, right? To enjoy the fruits of your labor. But if you think about it, it doesn't stop there. Because you have to, as you enjoy, you have to also have your eyes towards the future, right? Next year, saving some seeds back. So any piece of fruit, any vegetable, what's in that piece of fruit? Seeds. Tons of seeds. We've started harvesting our seeds. Think about multiplication. Think about reproduction. And it's not just so that we could survive. Man, we would have so much we could share. We would have abundance. And so you think about just that whole process that God is hardwired in. We're doing a series in about a month called Garden Theology. Lessons on the kingdom of God gleaned from the garden. And if you think about Jesus, think about as he was reteaching his disciples about life in the kingdom. He went to agriculture, didn't he? More so than to any other place, any other discipline. So to be a successful gardener certainly means you and I understanding the seed work, right? Quality of the seed. You want to get some heirlooms, something that's going to reproduce, not any of that new stuff, right, that won't reproduce. You want to think about maybe some germination rates, but there's something I didn't mention. If you think about it, you must take into consideration not just the seed, but also the soil. Yes, the soil. If you think about Matthew chapter 13, that first lesson on the kingdom of God, he's going to pick up on the parable of the 4 soils. And he's going to basically remind us that you can have the best seeds on the planet. These can be the best heirloom seeds, but if you neglect to be a good student of the conditions of the soil, you'll never make it into the Green Thumb Club, will you? You won't. And so here's what I'm kind of driving at this morning and kind of set up our time together, is that the gospel is never planted in a vacuum, but always in a context. Let me say it again. The gospel as a seed is never planted in a vacuum, but always into a context, the soil. Whether that be an individual context like our lives, your own heart, your own life, your own story, or a cultural context. Think about Asheville, think about cities, a collective group of people that start to have a common identity, a common story, right? And so as you think about us to be good missionaries, to be good spiritual gardeners, requires that we be not just good students of the Word of God and of the gospel, we must also equally become good stewards of the soil that God has placed us in, for which we are to be faithful, right? And so this morning we're going to be talking about what it means to be good stewards of the soil. Paul's entire life, Paul's entire ministry was to seeing the seed of the gospel go forward in culture, to reproduce, to multiply. His goal was that there would be good, healthy, nutritionally dense, organic gospel fruit that cities and people could feast on, and their lives would begin to be remade back into God's image. And so, if you think about it this morning, we're going to be journeying with Paul together as he sought to plant the seed of the gospel into Corinthian soil. Okay? So if you have a Bible, you can go ahead and start making your way to 1 Corinthians chapter 2. We're going to be spending our time in verses 1 through 5. And so to kind of start us out, what I want to do is do a little bit of soil work with us, okay? If you're going to have a garden, you have to get your hands dirty. Yeah. If you don't get dirty, you'll never have a garden. So we're going to get our hands dirty a little bit in this Corinthian soil. If you think about Corinth, if you know anything about the Corinthians, it was a very affluent culture. It was a culture that placed a high premium on philosophy, on the arts, a very intellectual culture. It was very Grecian in its origin. If you think about it, they also it was a very sexual culture. It was very sensational. They had a love affair with knowledge and with power. If you think about how Paul intros the book, and he starts to talk about the divisions, the factions. I am of Paul. I am of Apollos. I am of Cephas. They had this stumbling block of a personality, and they were separating out. And in fact, the first 6 chapters of the book is just Paul rebuking them, bringing them back into alignment, where he could eventually give them some replies to some of their questions. So already, that being said, guess what? The gospel had actually taken root in this culture, because there was a church here. There was a group of people who had said yes to the gospel. This thing had taken root in their lives, and boom, we have ourselves a church. Paul is now writing the book to tend to the crop, to make sure that this crop is going to last, and it's going to grow up into what God had called it to be. You guys with me? So as we look at chapter 2, we're going to begin to see how Paul reminded them of how the gospel worked as that went into the culture of their own lives. Look at chapter 2, verses 1 and 2. It says, "When I came to you, brothers, I did not, listen to that, come to you proclaiming the testimony of God with lofty speech or wisdom. For I decided," see that? I decided. I chose. NASB will say, "I determined to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and Him crucified." Okay, let's start out with just what Paul said he did not do. What did it say he did not do? What was he determined not to do?
Lofty words.
Yeah, no lofty words, no wisdom. Now, was it just because Paul was too country? Paul just didn't have any of that in his tool belt. He's like, I can't even get on y'all's level, so I'm not even going to say it. I'm not even going to try to. Right? That could be a way to think about it. If you know anything about some of the culture back then, there were 3 university cities. There was Athens, very learned people there. It was a university city. Think about Paul's sermon at Marseille, Acts 17. There was also a place called Alexandria. Had a huge library there. And there was a traveling companion of Paul that said he was eloquent and mighty in the scriptures. We're talking about Apollos. Very huge asset to Paul. Well, there was a 3rd university city. It was Tarsus. Where was Paul from?
Tarsus.
Paul was from Tarsus. Paul, if you remember his story, he was valedictorian at Pharisee University. Paul Paul knew his stuff. He was a good Jewish boy that was trained up in Greek culture. What an amazing individual. And so, what I want you to get from the outset is there's no doubt Paul could have went to task with this culture. He had the chops. He could have handled it. And I want you to see he chose not to. We have to get this, church. He determined not to go there. And the question you should be asking yourself this morning is why? Why wouldn't Paul employ those skills? You think it was difficult for Paul not to play that card? What do you think the Corinthians might have started to assume about Paul because he didn't go there? We're just going to kind of condescend on you a little bit, Paul. You don't kind of measure up to our cultural standards. And then maybe they disrespect him. They don't buy into him. They begin to form opinions and perceptions about him that are not true. Why in the world would Paul adopt such a foolish, ridiculous strategy? If you know anything about Paul's ministry to Corinth, would Paul have some problems with these people? As we move along in the story of 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, he would have respect and authority issues all throughout this book. And they would compare Paul to some of these other apostles, and they would say, Paul, you're just not that impressive. You don't make a very good showing in the flesh. We like some of these other apostles better than you. And Paul would have a big problem here in this church. And if you remember 2 Corinthians chapter 12, where does Paul say he visited? He says, I'm going to have to boast just a little bit. I've been into the third heavens. And then they're like all scratching their heads. Like, okay, all right, we kind of get it now. But they forced him into boasting because of this issue they had in Corinthian culture. And so, Paul's ultimate commitment, I want to remind you, was to see this seed planted. So he was determined, therefore, to know nothing among them except Christ and Him crucified. We'll touch on a little bit about what this looks like in just a second. Look at verse 3, as we're going to see a little bit more about his approach to getting the gospel into this culture. I was with you in weakness, in fear, much trembling. My speech and my message were not in plausible words of wisdom, but in demonstration of spirit and of power. So Paul went to this Corinthian culture. Here's what the Spirit would tell him to do. Paul, I'm going to call you into weakness. Anybody here like to feel weak? No, I don't like to feel weak at all. Paul, I'm going to call you into non-eloquence, to be non-impressive. Downplay your gifts. Downplay your education. Downplay your knowledge. You see, what you catch a people with, you must keep a people with, right? If you've been here and you've done any dating, right, fellas? What you catch them with, you got to keep them with. If you start playing other things, and it's not really who you are, you're going to have some problems on the other side of that marriage covenant, right? It's the same thing in church planting. What you catch them with, you must keep them with. You and I want to catch people. If we catch people with anything other than the gospel, guess what we got to keep them with? Something other than the gospel. And so Paul was saying, this is the commitment. You know, for me, it's scary to plant a church. And I know this kind of weakness. I know this kind of fear because I've experienced it. You know, we set out to plant a church here in Soma, or in Asheville, and we were committed to obedience to Jesus. We were committed to being led by the Spirit and walking out as best we could what it would look like. And, you know, real soon, you know what the Spirit started doing? Taking us off the spreadsheet. And I was like, Holy Spirit, what are you doing? Why would you ever go off the spreadsheet here? This is how we're going to plant this church. Right? I already have it scripted. So you get back on the spreadsheet. The Spirit said, we're going to get off the spreadsheet a little bit. And what I began to see as we started to move into this city, get to know you guys, get to know the Heartbeat, is Spirit started doing things a lot different from the way I had originally planned. And we started to plant this church, honestly, almost backwards from the way most church plants get started. Most church plants, just so you know, highly funded. A lot of times we're in the $300,000 range. There's 3 or 4 part-time staff people. There's the marketing flyers. There's the beer glasses. There's the T-shirts. There's the Banjo Appalachia Band, right? There's all the stuff on the front end when they parachute in. God started trimming all that stuff back as we started making plans to get here. And when we get here, guess who was with us?
The Holy Spirit.
That's about right, man. Nobody. The Holy Spirit. And I thought, Jesus has made a big mistake with this whole thing. And what I began to see, the Spirit had some very different plans about how He was going to plant the gospel again. And so the work was being done in my own life, in my own soul, so I could get on the same page with what the Spirit of God was doing.
Amen.
You know, I tell you what, you think it was easy for me to follow the Spirit as He would do that? It was so challenging to trust God knew best how to do this. Let me ask you a question. Could I have all that other stuff, and yet if we did not have Jesus embodied among a group of people, would we have a church? No. What if we didn't have any of that other stuff, but we had Jesus embodied among a group of people as a family? Would we have a church?
Yes.
Yes. Now, are all those other things bad or wrong or evil? Of course not. No, they're good things. We will have those things. You guys have some of those things. But the problem is, herein lies the danger for us, church, is our own ingenuity and our own strategies sometimes get in the way of us growing up into Christ. And we begin to put all of our hope and all of our confidence in all these other things to make us somebody rather than Jesus. We set out to plant a church where we said we don't want people to be impressed with us. We want people to be impressed with our Savior, with our Jesus. And I think for us, for Calvary, we want God, not God, we want God too to be impressed. We want the people that we're called to reach not to be impressed with us. We want them to be impressed with our Savior, right?
Yes.
And so that's the whole heartbeat. So if I could just summarize real quickly, the Spirit intentionally led Paul into a very non-impressive church planting strategy so that they could begin to see just how impressive Jesus really is. And I have found, now doing this for a lot of years, that Jesus is just not that impressive to the flesh and to people's flesh. But for those of whom the Spirit is at work in, to those of whom God is drawing, that Jesus becomes very impressive. And He starts to change them. He starts to draw them. And so back to my question, why in the world would the Spirit of God lead Paul to plant such a crazy, ridiculous, foolish strategy? Look at verse 5. Here's Paul, here's his reason. So that your faith might not rest in the wisdom of men, but in the power of God. Paul was so committed to these people having their faith rest and have the right DNA, have the right foundation, that Paul would say, at great cost to himself, at great cost to his reputation, he will obey Jesus. Has anybody seen the John Adams HBO series that's out, where it kind of chronicles his story in the early American story? There's a great scene in the very first part of that. The title is Joy or Die. And there's all this fracturing of the colonies. It's a real testing point in the history of our country. And John Adams moves to Boston. He's not a Boston man, but he moves into town, and he has just gotten there, and there's an altercation in the public square. And there's still redcoats all in the city. They fire upon a crowd of about 200 people, and 6 Americans are killed. And nobody in Boston is going to represent these redcoats. And finally, they come to John Adams and they say, will you represent us? And he, of course, takes the case. He's in the middle. And again, it's a testing point for the nation because if you know anything about our country, we're supposed to be founded on this idea of justice and equity and fairness for all. But yet there's this heavy bias against the taxation without representation, against this abuse, they would say, this unfairness. And so will they try these men based on their bias, or will they give these men a fair hearing? Right? That's kind of how this sets up. The night before the closing arguments, John Adams is He has a secret weapon in his back pocket. It's his wife, Abigail, like all of us guys. And he gives Abigail his closing arguments. And she's reading it, and he's pacing, and he's all squirmish. And she gets done, and she's not persuaded. And of course, he's upset about it. And she begins to talk to him. And it's not because John Adams was sloppy and underprepared. It's the opposite. He was overprepared. And she says, in a great way, you don't have to quote great men to show you are one. And she says, you have overburdened your argument with ostentatious erudition. Which, I don't know what that means, but John Adams did. But she's basically saying, or she says, some of your jury might think you are out to prove the brilliance of the speaker rather than the truth of the case being tried. And what Abigail saw, that she helped John with, was that you can rightly prove that you're the smartest man in all of Boston and maybe lose this case, or you can give up your reputation to try the truth for these men, that maybe, just maybe, justice might prevail and these men may go free, and thus prove the very premise of why miracles started in the beginning. Well, he trusts Abigail, and he wins the case. And these men go free. The redcoats go free. As you think about Paul, as you think about us, we're faced with the same dilemma. Paul was faced with the same dilemma. This church getting planted in Corinth would come at great cost to his reputation, to his life. And yet, Paul was willing to see whatever it would take that this seed of the gospel to take root in this stony, rocky, Corinthian soil. We would say, it's impossible to plant a church in a Corinthian culture. Well, we're not that different, are we? American soil is not all that different. We're going to conclude here in just a second. Has anybody seen the 4 Spiritual Laws? That little yellow booklet? Yeah, I came to Jesus with the 4 Spiritual Laws in college. Shared the gospel with him. If you know anything about, you guys do know about the culture. When Bill Bright was coming up through, it was a very modern, scientific, naturalistic, mechanistic, impersonal universe. That was largely the narrative that was getting espoused as to how life was to work. It's a closed system. Nothing comes in from the outside. And Bill Bright, as he sought to preach the gospel into that soil, would say, just as there are 4 laws, just as there are physical laws that govern the universe, so there are 4 spiritual laws that govern your relationship with God. Is that how it goes, Sam? Something like that? And he started to walk through these absolute laws that never change in the spiritual universe. And then he started to show how this God was actually personal, not impersonal. And as Bill Bright captured, and Billy Graham, a form of the gospel tailored to that culture, you know what we saw? We saw lots of fruit, didn't we? Lots of receptivity. The challenge for you and I is the context, the soil has changed. The questions, the longings, the aspirations, the idols that were part of that culture are largely not a part of this culture. The soil has changed. So part of our challenge, we're not going to get there today because I don't want to go for another hour, but some of what we're working on is how do we begin to take the gospel, which doesn't change and is embodied in Jesus, but the form has to go into the culture you're trying to preach into. And so that's our task as the church, as the soil is changed, to know how to faithfully do that. And you can see Paul doing it in this book. There's Greeks and there's Jews. There's those after wisdom, there's those after power. And Paul would start to preach the gospel of a higher wisdom that the Greeks could access as they would confess their fools. They could tap into this secret treasonous logic of the universe where you win by losing, you gain by giving, you find strength in weakness, you gain life by losing life. I can't see that. That's right. It's a different logic. It's a higher wisdom. Or with power. The Jews had this love affair for power. And he would say, you will only find access to the hidden power of God as you yield up your life of weakness. And so it's a stumbling block, right? Or it's foolishness, but to those who are being called of God, Christ, the power of God, Christ, the wisdom of God. And Paul would start to take that message and form it in. I share that with us to say, what if we go to Asheville and we start preaching those 4 spiritual laws and they just blow it off? They may be rejecting Jesus, maybe, or they may be encountering a form of the gospel that's not answering the longings and the questions of the idols they're asking. So some of our challenge as God's people is to listen and hear stories and begin to take Jesus and insert it surgically into the hearts that they're at, the questions they're asking. Does that make sense?
Yes.
That's our task as the church. All right, so if you're in here and this seed of the gospel has taken root in your life, then I got good news for you. You're already part of the Green Thumb Club, all right? This is your calling. This is my calling. And the whole heartbeat of Jesus, if I go back to John chapter 15, this great chapter on abiding. 6 times, and I know Jesus, and I'm walking with Jesus, and I'm an orange. But as we get to know the fruit of their lives, they don't look like oranges. They look like apples. No, I'm really an orange tree. I promise you, you look like an apple. See, Jesus uses that simple logic. And the problem with the Pharisees is they were taking their lives, and they were using a permanent marker, and they were coloring themselves orange. And thus deceiving all kinds of people, playing this up again. That's why Jesus got so upset at the Pharisees. And so for us in the room, whether Jesus is after retilling up our own lives, or whether he's after really tilling up our culture, Jesus is the only one that's going to make that orange tree, right? He retills us up, and he makes us who we are to be. And so, this past year, Jesus has been really retilling up my own soil, and that's a good process. And so, just because we're in here, and just because we've said yes to Jesus, don't think your soil, your permaculture, as Ashley will tell you, doesn't need some work. It always needs work. And so as we retool to be a faithful people, Jesus has to also do his own work in us. So don't resist that. That's a good process. God has all of us in to reshape us, and we can be a type of people that can offer harvest to our city. Because Jesus, that's what he wants to do. So harvest is going to come again, because Jesus is committed to building his kingdom. Right?
Yes.
And so the task for us is embracing that process that he has us on. So let's pray, okay? Father, you are the master gardener. You really are. And you know best how to feed us, how to feed our city, how to feed the world. You know, in those kingdom analogies, there's a tree that's going to come up. And it says, all the birds of the air shall nest under this tree. All types of cultures and people and cities, nations will find rest in its shade. And the truth is, we have found that rest, and we have found that shade. And sometimes we never want to go back out, where it's hot and challenging, and the conditions are adverse. And yet you're calling us to do that. It doesn't have to be big and fancy, and it can just be going across the street. It can be a word at the grocery store. It can be a prayer in the moment when we see a need. It's our own families called to love and to serve. So I pray that as you have your work with us, you will multiply the fruit that will go out into Haywood Road and this city, and as far as you want to take it. It could go out even further. So I thank you that you haven't given up on your people, and your love is so abiding. And if you would have given up on your disciples, and you would have given up on us, but you didn't give up on them. And so we are here to ask you to continue your work. And we thank you this morning for how you've encouraged us, you've encouraged me. We pray in your name, Jesus. Amen.
Please stand as we sing.